The ice in Carolyn's glass clinked against the crystal, a lonely, rhythmic sound that timed the cadence of her own erasure. At 70, Carolyn Henry was a masterpiece of aging, her skin the color of creamed coffee, her silver hair cropped into a chic, defiant bob, and her spine as straight as a Tuscan pillar. But to the people sitting across her mahogany dining table, she was already a ghost. "The gardens are award-winning, Mom," her son Robert said, leaning forward. He spoke with that practiced, overly enunciated patience one might use with a toddler or a golden retriever. "And the medical staff is top tier. You won't have to worry about the stairs anymore." "Or the loneliness," his wife Susan added, her voice sugary and thin. "It's a community, Carolyn. People your speed." Carolyn didn't look up from her salmon. She felt vibrant. She felt the blood hum in her veins. She felt the sharp, acidic wit dancing behind her teeth. But the more she tried to speak lately, the more they talked over her, weaving a shroud of safety and care that was slowly suffocating her. They weren't looking at the woman who had run a gallery for 40 years. They were looking at a liability. "I'm not going," Carolyn said, her voice low and direct. Robert didn't even pause. "We've already scouted the Westbury wing. If we sell this house by autumn, the transition will be seamless." They were dividing the spoils of her life while she was still breathing the air in the room. Later that night, the house felt cavernous. The family had left, draped in the smug satisfaction of having the hard conversation. Carolyn sat in her library, the only light coming from a single amber lamp. She poured a glass of 20-year-old scotch, peaty, sharp, and expensive. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up her phone. Loneliness wasn't a lack of people. It was the lack of her people. On an impulse born of grief and the burn of alcohol, she opened her contacts and tapped the name Tony. Her husband had been gone for 5 years. The number had surely been reassigned a dozen times over, but she needed to send the words into the ether. She needed to say them to someone who wouldn't tell her to take a nap. "I'm still vibrant," she typed, her thumbs sure and steady. "I am still here, but they've already buried me." She hit send and closed her eyes, letting a single tear track through her makeup. Seoul, South Korea, 4 a.m. The 74th floor of the L-Gate Tower was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition. Maruhan Park Lee so stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the neon veins of Seoul pulsing 100 feet below his Italian leather soles. At 50, Maruhan was the tech mafia of the East. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't need to. He held the patents for the chips that ran the world's satellites. He owned the data that moved markets. He was a man of absolute silence and terrifying reach. His personal phone, a device known to only 4 people in the world, vibrated on the obsidian desk. Maruhan frowned. He picked it up, expecting a crisis alert from the London Exchange or a security breach in Singapore. Instead, he saw a message from a Virginia area code. "I'm still vibrant. I'm still here, but they've already buried me." He stared at the words. In a world of sycophants who whispered scripted praise and enemies who plotted in code, this was an anomaly. It was raw. It was bold. It was a cry of war from someone who sounded like they were losing. He thought of his own life, the board members trying to age him out, the younger sharks circling his throne, the cold sterility of his success. He felt the weight of his own golden cage. His fingers hovered over the screen. He should delete it. He should block the number. Instead, he typed back, "Then you are in the wrong grave." In Virginia, the phone on Carolyn's nightstand chimed. She jolted awake, her heart hammering. She reached for the device, expecting a bounce-back error or a confused, "Who is this?" She read the reply. The breath left her lungs. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a suggestion for a senior center. It was a recognition. For the first time in years, Carolyn Henry didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a target. And for a woman like her, that was infinitely more exciting. She sat up, took a final sip of her scotch, and began to type. The weeks that followed was a blur of digital ghosts and blue light confessions. The text began as a trickle and turned into a flood. They talked about everything. For Maruhan, it was a reprieve from the sterile silence of his life. For Carolyn, it was a lifeline. She called him Seoul, and he called her Virginia. Seoul, I'm looking at a man who has been my loyal shadow for 12 years. My data says he is efficient. My gut says he is a ghost. How do you know when loyalty has turned into a countdown? Carolyn sat in her garden, watching a spider weave a web between two rose bushes. She thought of the gallery, the wealthy patrons who promised to buy a collection just to keep a rival from having it, only to disappear when the check was due. Virginia, efficiency is a mask, Seoul. It's what people use when they want to be invisible. Does he look you in the eye? Seoul, always. Too much, perhaps. Virginia, then he's rehearsing. A truly loyal man doesn't need to prove his gaze, but watch his tell. Everyone has one. In my world, it was the way a collector touched their watch when they were lying about their budget. What does your shadow do when he's uncomfortable? Maruhan looked across his office at Choi, his COO. Choi was presenting a flawless report on the new merger. He looked perfect. But as Maruhan watched, he noticed it. Every time Choi mentioned the word transparency, his left hand moved to his cufflink, twisting it exactly twice. Seoul, he twists his cufflinks. Every time we speak of the merger. Virginia, he's not twisting a cufflink, Seoul. He's checking a leash. He's nervous because he sold something that doesn't belong to him. He's already gone. You're just the last one to know. 3 days later. Maruhan sat in his armored car, the neon lights of the Gangnam district blurring past. He had authorized a private forensic audit of Choi's personal server. He found the logic bomb, a backdoor code that would have given a rival company access to Elgate's entire encrypted network. Choi hadn't been efficient. He had been a predator in the tall grass. Seoul, you were right. He was minutes away from pulling the trigger on a betrayal that would have cost me billions. How did a woman 5,000 miles away see what my security team missed? Virginia, because your security team looks at code. I look at the man. Code doesn't have a soul, Seoul. It doesn't get greedy, and it doesn't get scared. But a man who has lived in your shadow for 12 years eventually gets tired of the dark. He didn't want your money. He wanted your light. Maruhan stared at the screen. He was used to advisors who gave him spreadsheets. Carolyn gave him truth. She was direct, blunt, and had the terrifying calm of someone who had seen it all. Seoul, you are dangerous. Virginia, I'm 70, Maruhan. At my age, you either become invisible or you become dangerous. I chose the latter. It's much more fun. Seoul, Who are you? Truly? Virginia, I'm the person you've been waiting to talk to your whole life. Now, tell me about this rival CEO you're worried about. Does he wear expensive shoes with cheap socks? Because if he does, he's a man who cares about the finish but ignores the foundation. He'll be easy to break. Maruhan let out a sharp, genuine laugh that startled his driver. He realized he didn't care about the age, the distance, or the impossibility of it. He was addicted to the way she stripped the world down to its bones. She wasn't a tech advisor. She was a master of human nature. And for a man who ruled a kingdom of machines, she was the only thing that felt real. The morning light in Virginia was gray and medicinal, filtered through the heavy drapes Robert had insisted on closing to keep the draft out. Carolyn sat at her desk, her hands folded over a leather-bound blotter. Across from her, Robert looked exhausted, the skin beneath his eyes sagging with the weight of his own perceived righteousness. He laid a thick stack of vellum white paper between them. "It's time, Mom," he said. His voice was a flat, rehearsed monotone. "The Westbury papers. I've already signed as your power of attorney. You just need to initial the transition of the deed. It's for the best. You're drifting. You're spending all night on your phone, talking to heaven knows who. It's a sign, Mom. You're not safe alone." Carolyn looked at the pen. It was a cheap plastic thing he'd brought from his office. He wouldn't even let her use her own fountain pen to sign away her life. "I am 70, Robert. I am not dead," she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibrate. "You're acting like a child," he snapped, his patience finally fraying. "The movers are coming on Friday. The house is being listed. Sign the papers, or I'll have the court-appointed evaluator here by noon to declare you incompetent. Don't make me do that." He walked out to take a business call, leaving her in the silence of her own impending tomb. Carolyn's fingers flew to her phone. Her breath was shallow, the first lick of true panic cooling her blood. "Virginia, they've done it. The papers are on my desk. They're taking my house, my name, my heir. I'm being imprisoned in a cage of care. I don't think I can fight them alone, Seoul." 5,000 miles away, the sun was setting over the Han River. Maruhan was in the back of his Maybach, his eyes narrowed at the screen. For the first time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in decades. Protective rage. "Seoul, where are you?" "Exactly. Virginia. Charlottesville, Virginia. The house on Ivy Lane. My son, he thinks he's a shark. He's just a man who wants my inheritance to cover his own failing debts." Maruhan didn't reply. He didn't need to. He tapped a button on his intercom. "Secretary Kim," Maruhan said, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Find a man named Robert Henry in Charlottesville, Virginia. I want his credit score, his mortgage holder, and his primary business lenders. Now." "Sir?" Kim's voice crackled. "That's a private citizen in the States. We have no—" "I didn't ask for a lecture on jurisdiction," Maruhan interrupted. "I want his life on a platter in 10 minutes. And call the chairman of Hanguk Global Bank. Tell him I'm looking to diversify my U.S. real estate portfolio, starting with the distressed debt of a small-town American branch." Back in Virginia, an hour had passed. Robert walked back into the library looking smug. "The evaluator is on his way, Mom. Last chance to do this the easy way." Suddenly, Robert's phone shrieked. He frowned, looking at the ID. My bank? 1 second. Carolyn watched her son's face. It was a slow-motion car crash. His skin went from flushed red to a sickly, translucent gray. What do you mean, acquired? Robert stammered into the phone. My bridge loan for the construction project was guaranteed. I have 30 days. You can't call the note now. He paused, his eyes widening. He began to shake. Who? The Elgate Group? I don't even know who that... Wait, my mortgage too? Why are you transferring my personal home mortgage to a foreign entity? Robert looked at Carolyn. She sat perfectly still, her chin tilted up, looking every bit the queen he had tried to dethrone. They're seizing my assets, Mom, Robert whispered, the phone slipping from his hand. Everything. My firm, my house. They said a strategic restructuring is underway, and my presence is no longer required in my own company. 2 days later, Carolyn's phone chimed. A simple, elegant notification. Seoul, check your front door. Carolyn stood up and walked to the entrance. A sleek black sedan was idling at the curb. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, holding a silver briefcase. He didn't look like a social worker. He looked like an apex predator. Mrs. Henry, the man asked, bowing slightly. My name is Mr. Smith. I represent the Elgate Group. We have acquired your son's debt, your home's title, and the Westbury facility itself. My employer wanted me to give you this. He handed her a single embossed card. It was blank, save for a phone number and 3 words in gold leaf. You are free. Carolyn looked back at the house. The facility was now her property. The debt that had been used to blackmail her was now a weapon in the hands of a man in Seoul who had never even seen her face. She took a deep breath of the Virginia air. It tasted like cold silk. Virginia, you did this for me? Seoul, I don't like people touching what I'm interested in. And you, Virginia, you belong to the world of the living. Days later, Maruhan sent her a photo of a vase he had received as a gift, a peace offering from a rival. Seoul, Kang, the CEO of Daesung, sent me a rare 19th century vase today. He wants to discuss a merger. My analysts say it's a sign of strength. What do you see? Virginia? I see a desperate man trying to buy time. That's a Qing Dynasty copy, Seoul. It's beautiful, but the glaze is too perfect. It was made to deceive. Now tell me, who in your inner circle has been praising King lately? Seoul, Choi. He's been pushing the Daesung merger for weeks, saying it's the only way to stabilize our stock. Virginia, there it is. The fake vase and the shaking hands. Choi wasn't just nervous. He had been bought by a man who deals in forgeries. They aren't merging with you, Seoul. They're trying to replace you. A week after the hostile takeover of Robert's debt, the air in the Henry household was thick with the scent of defeat. Robert sat in the kitchen, staring at a frozen computer screen, his credit lines severed and his authority evaporated. He looked smaller, a man deflated by a ghost he couldn't see. Carolyn, however, moved with the grace of a woman who had just shed 20 years of winter. Her phone chimed on the marble counter. Seoul, tea is better in person. I have a Gulfstream G 650 idling at Dulles. It is fueled for 14 hours. Come to Seoul. 1 day, 1 tea. If you wish to return, the jet will bring you back before the ice in your scotch melts. Carolyn didn't hesitate. She didn't consult a calendar or a doctor. She went to her closet and pulled out the garment bag she hadn't opened since her husband's gallery opening in Paris. A vintage, midnight blue Chanel suit with gold buttons that caught the morning light like small captive suns. She packed a single leather carry-on, no sensible shoes, no just-in-case sweaters, just silk, perfume, and the audacity she had suppressed for a decade. As she walked toward the front door, she stopped at the foyer table. She took a heavy cream-colored card and wrote 6 words in her sharp, elegant script. "I've gone to see a friend." She didn't sign it Mom. She didn't leave instructions for the gardener. She simply walked out, the heels of her pumps clicking a rhythmic war cry against the driveway. The interior of the L Gate private jet was a sanctuary of white leather and brushed eucalyptus wood. Carolyn sat by the window, watching the Appalachian Mountains shrink into miniatures. A flight attendant, dressed in a uniform that cost more than Robert's car, bowed. "Chairman Lee has requested we fly the Great Circle route, Mrs. Henry. It will be the smoothest path. Would you care for a vintage Krug or the herbal tea he specifically ordered from the Blasian plantations?" "The tea," Carolyn said, her voice steady. "I want to be sharp when I land." For 14 hours, she watched the world curve beneath her. She thought about her life, the quiet dignity of her 30s, the busy chaos of her 50s, and the suffocating silence of her 60s. She realized she wasn't running away. She was running toward the only person who had looked at her soul and seen a fire instead of an ash heap. Incheon International Airport, Seoul, 9 p.m. The sun had long set, replaced by the electric, violet, and chrome glow of the most technologically advanced city on Earth. The jet touched down with a whisper, taxiing toward a private, high-security hangar emblazoned with the silver L logo. Carolyn stood at the top of the air stair. The humidity of the Korean night hit her first, smelling of rain and ozone. Below, a phalanx of black security SUVs stood like silent predators, their headlights cutting through the light mist. And there, standing alone at the base of the stairs, was the man. Maruhan Park Lee was not what she expected, yet he was exactly who the messages promised. He was 50, but he carried the energy of an ancient tempered blade. His suit was charcoal, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. His hair was black and swept back, revealing a face of sharp angles and eyes that looked as though they had seen the beginning and end of every deal ever made. He was lethal. He was stunning. He was the Mafia of a tech, and he was looking at her with an intensity that made the Virginia air feel like a distant, dusty memory. Carolyn stepped down the stairs, her Chanel suit rustling, her silver hair shimmering under the hangar lights. She didn't look like a grandmother. She looked like a revelation. She reached the bottom step. Maruhan didn't offer a polite handshake. He didn't bow. He simply stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming and magnetic. "You're late, Virginia," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in her chest. Carolyn tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze with a boldness that made his lips twitch into the faintest, rarest of smiles. "A woman of my age knows exactly when to arrive, Seoul," she countered. "The question is the tea still hot?" Maruhan reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve before he offered his arm. a gesture of both protection and total surrender. "The tea is hot," he whispered, "but the city is yours." The glass elevator ascended the side of the L Gate Tower like a silver bullet piercing the heavens. Inside, Carolyn watched the sprawling neon tapestry of Seoul shrink into a grid of electric amethyst and burning gold. Beside her, Maruhan stood in a silence that felt heavy, almost tectonic. Up close, he was a study in controlled power. His hands, resting at his sides, were large and scarred lightly at the knuckles. Not from brawls, she realized, but from a lifetime of restlessness. He was 50, in the absolute prime of his masculine authority, and she was 70. The math of it should have been jarring, yet as she caught their reflection in the glass, they looked like two halves of a dark, elegant myth. "You're staring, Virginia," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm calculating," Carolyn replied smoothly. "You're younger than I imagined, and far more dangerous." Maruhan turned his head, his gaze raking over her with a slow, deliberate intensity that would have withered a lesser woman. He didn't see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes as flaws. He saw them as a map of a territory he wanted to conquer. Age is a measurement of time. Power is a measurement of will. You have more will in your little finger than most of the men I destroy before breakfast. The elevator chimed. The doors opened directly into his penthouse, a sprawling glass kingdom, where the walls were screens and the furniture was carved from a black obsidian. "Tonight is the Blue Moon Gala," Maruhan said, gesturing to a sleek metallic box on the table. "The elite of Asia will be there. They expect me to bring a trophy. A 20-year-old with a blank stare and a designer dress. I want to give them a heart attack instead." Inside the box lay a necklace of raw, uncut black diamonds. The Grand Ballroom, Sheila, Seoul. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and the whispered conspiracies of the ultra-wealthy. This was the Mafia of tech, men who controlled the flow of information across 3 continents, accompanied by wives and mistresses polished to a high plastic sheen. When the double doors swung open, the room didn't just go quiet, it seemed to lose its oxygen. Maruhan Park Lee entered, his expression a mask of bored lethality, but it was the woman on his arm who caused the collective intake of breath, was swept up, held by a single obsidian, pin. She wore no heavy makeup to hide her age. She wore her 70 years like a suit of armor. The black diamonds at her throat caught the light, casting shadows that looked like ink on her skin. "Who is she?" whispered the daughter of a shipping tycoon, her voice laced with a mixture of horror and awe. She's an elder. She's a goddess," her husband muttered, unable to look away. Carolyn felt the weight of 1,000 stares. In Virginia, these people would have offered her a chair and spoken to her in loud, slow sentences. Here, under the burning gaze of Maruhan, she felt like a wildfire. Kang's patronizing smirk remained fixed, but his eyes were hard, scanning Carolyn with the clinical coldness of a man who viewed people as depreciating assets. "Chairman Lee, I didn't realize we were honoring the pioneers of the previous century tonight. Is this your historian?" The air around Maruhan turned to ice. His hand tightened on Carolyn's arm, his knuckles turning white as he prepared to crush the man's social standing with a single devastating sentence. But Carolyn's hand, cool, steady, and smelling faintly of gardenias, pressed against his chest. It was a silent command. Let me. She stepped forward. She didn't look like a predatory cat. She looked like a judge who had already reached a verdict. Mr. Kang, I presume? Carolyn's voice was quiet, the kind of stillness that forces a room to stop breathing. You have the look of a man who counts his chips before the cards are even dealt. It's a common trait in middle management. Kang's smirk faltered, his posture stiffening. I am the CEO of Daesung, madam, hardly middle management. And yet, Carolyn continued, her eyes raking over his silk lapels with a clinical detachment, you sent your man, Mr. Choi, to do your dirty work. I told Maruhan weeks ago that Choi was a man whose conscience was shaking. A man like you only gives a gift that's expensive when he's trying to hide the fact that he's bankrupt. The color drained from Kang's face. The mention of the vase and the link to Choi was a surgical strike. I've spent 40 years watching people try to pass off high-quality fakes as originals, Mr. Kang, Carolyn said, her voice dropping to a velvet rasp. You and your informant are very poor copies of the men you pretend to be. You didn't choose Choi because he was clever. You chose him because he was as hollow as that porcelain. She stepped even closer, into his personal space, her directness acting like a physical weight. Maruhan didn't fire Choi because of a glitch or a spreadsheet. He fired him because I reminded him that a lion doesn't negotiate with a flea. He simply shakes it off. And looking at you now, I see I was right. You aren't a rival. You're just a man who ran out of lies. Kong's face didn't just turn purple. He looked like he'd been slapped by a ghost. He looked around the room, realizing that the feeble grandmother had just exposed his failed coup and his financial desperation in front of the very people he needed to impress. Maruhan let out a low, dark chuckle that sent shivers down the spines of everyone within earshot. He leaned in, his mouth close to Carolyn's ear, but his eyes fixed on the trembling Kang. I told you, Virginia, he whispered, they aren't ready for a woman who knows how to spot a fake. For the rest of the night, the starlets and the billionaires parted like the Red Sea. Carolyn didn't sit in the senior corner. She stood at the center of the room, sipping a dry martini, dismantling corporate egos with a single sentence and a direct gaze. She was 70, vibrant and bold. And for the first time in her life, she was with a man who didn't want to protect her from the world. He wanted to unleash her upon it. As the gala wound down, Maruhan led her toward the balcony. The wind whipped her silver hair. They're terrified of you, he whispered, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. Good, Carolyn said, looking out at the city she was beginning to claim. I'm tired of being sweet. I'd much rather be feared. Maruhan reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then you've come to the right place, my queen. 2 days later, the penthouse was a hive of digital activity. Maruhan stood before a holographic display of the Jeju port logistics. He was frustrated, his tie already pulled loose. The Daesung Group is a black box, Carolyn, Maruhan said, gesturing to the fluctuating red lines. Xinhua is requesting a truce, but her ships are stalling in the harbor. There are whispers of a labor strike. If the port freezes, L-Gate loses the tech corridor. I have to decide by tonight whether to buy her out or retreat. Carolyn didn't look at the logistics. She sat in a lounge chair, a tablet in her hand, but she wasn't looking at spreadsheets. She was watching a high-definition recording of Shinhwa at a ribbon-cutting ceremony from 3 days ago. "Stop the video, Maruhan," Carolyn said. "Rewind 10 seconds. Look at her neck." Maruhan frowned, but obeyed. On the screen, the matriarch of Daesung was smiling for the cameras, but as a reporter asked about liquidity, her hand fluttered to the jade pendant at her throat. It was a micro-movement lasting less than a second. "That's a clutch reflex," Carolyn explained, her voice calm and clinical. "In the gallery, I saw it 1,000 times. A woman who is truly wealthy wears her jewelry. A woman who is about to lose it protects it. She isn't worried about a strike, Maruhan. She's worried about her collateral." "But the short position?" Maruhan asked, leaning in. "How do you see a market gamble in a hand gesture?" "It's not in the gesture, it's in the omission," Carolyn replied, standing up to join him at the monitors. "Show me her son's recent activity." Maruhan pulled up the data. "He's been quiet, buying small blocks of shipping insurance." "No," Carolyn corrected, her finger tracing the buy orders. "Look at the dates. He's buying insurance on ships that aren't even scheduled to sail. That's not insurance. It's a hedge. They are betting against their own company. They want the strike rumors to drive the price down because they've already bet that the stock will fail. They're trying to burn the house down to collect the insurance money because the bank is already at the door." Maruhan stared at the data. He had seen the numbers, but he hadn't seen the motive. "She thinks I'm a technocrat who only looks at code," Maruhan whispered, a dark, appreciative smile spreading across his face. "She doesn't realize I have a master profiler sitting in my living room." The atmosphere in the private dining room of Kwan's, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, was thick with the scent of aged soy and unspoken threats. Maruhan sat at the head of the low rosewood table, his legs crossed with a casual lethality. To his right sat Carolyn. She had traded her silver silk for a structured, charcoal-colored hanbok-inspired suit. She looked like a monolith of marble in a room full of flickering candles. Across from them sat Shinhwa, the matriarch of the rival Daesung group, and her son, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. They had invited Maruhan to discuss a truce, but their eyes kept sliding to Carolyn with a mixture of pity and calculated glee. "It is unconventional, Chairman Lee," Shinhwa said, her voice a polished rasp. She poured tea with a precision that was meant to highlight Carolyn's supposed fragility. "To bring a guest of such venerable standing to a negotiation of this magnitude. Does the lady require a softer cushion? Or perhaps the menu read in a larger font?" Maruhan's jaw tightened. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. He reached for his glass, his knuckles white, but Carolyn's hand moved first. She didn't grab his arm to restrain him. She simply rested a single, steady finger on the back of his hand. The contact was electric. Maruhan went still. "The font is quite legible, Madame Shinhwa," Carolyn said, her voice like honey poured over gravel. "Though I find your tea service a bit rushed. The leaves haven't fully opened, much like your strategy for the Jeju port acquisition." The room went silent. The son dropped his chopsticks. "You've been leaking rumors of a labor strike to drive the port's valuation down," Carolyn continued, her eyes never leaving the older woman's. "You expect Maruhan to pull his investment to protect his assets? But you're sitting on a massive short position in the shipping sector that matures in 48 hours. You aren't trying to negotiate a truce. You're trying to survive a bankruptcy. Shinhwa's composure didn't just crack, it shattered. You are a tourist. You know nothing of our markets. I know people, Carolyn countered. She leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in her sharp, intelligent eyes. I've watched 3 generations of men like your son try to bluff with a pair of twos. I saw the way you touched your jade pendant when I mentioned the port. It's a nervous habit, madame. One you've had since you were a girl, I imagine. It tells me that you're terrified. Carolyn turned to Maruhan, who was watching her with an expression that bordered on worship. They don't have the capital to fight you, Seoul, she said softly. They're using my presence here as a distraction because they have nothing else left to play. They thought my age was a blind spot. They didn't realize it's a telescope. Maruhan stood up. He didn't look at the rivals. He looked only at the woman beside him. The woman the world had tried to put in a home, who had just dismantled a multi-billion-dollar psychological ambush with a glance and a memory. The meeting is over, Maruhan announced. As they walked out into the cool Seoul night, the neon lights reflecting in the puddles like spilled ink, Maruhan stopped her by the door of the limousine. He didn't open the door. He turned her to face him, his hands gripping her shoulders, not with the gentleness one uses for the elderly, but with the desperate hunger of a man who has finally found his North Star. I thought I brought you here to show you the world, he whispered, his forehead dropping to touch hers. But I was wrong. Oh, Carolyn arched a silver brow. I need you, he said, the words raw and stripped of his usual corporate armor. My empire is just glass and silicon. You are the blood in the machine. Stay, not as a guest, as my partner, as my equal. Carolyn looked at the man who was 20 years her junior, yet 1,000 years more tired. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb stroking the rough stubble of his jaw. I told you once, Seoul, she whispered. Power is boring if you don't have anyone to wield it with. I think it's time we showed them what a real dynasty looks like. In that moment, the cultural clash ended. It wasn't about Virginia or Seoul anymore. It was about 2 predators who had found their pack. The storm outside the 100th floor windows was silent, a muted war of rain against reinforced glass. Inside the penthouse, the air smelled of wood and the ghost of expensive scotch. There were no assistants here, no security detail standing in the shadows, only the low amber hum of floor lamps and the vast glittering expanse of Seoul beneath them. Maruhan stood by the bar, his silk tie loosened, the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man who had been carrying the weight of the sky for too long. They call me a monster in the press, he said, his voice dropping into a gravelly register that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He handed Carolyn a crystal glass, his fingers lingering against hers for a second longer than necessary. They say I have a heart made of silicon and ice. Carolyn took a sip, the liquid warmth blooming in her chest. She was wearing a cream silk robe he had left for her, the fabric draped over her shoulders like a second skin. And do you? Maruhan leaned back against the counter, watching her. The way the light caught the silver in her hair made her look like something carved from moonlight. I had to. My father lost everything to men like Kang. I watched him diminish, until he was nothing but a shadow in a small room. I promised myself I would never be small. I would be the room. I would be the building. I would be the city. He looked down at his hands that had crushed companies and broken lives without ever firing a shot. But the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets, Carolyn. I've been gasping for breath for 20 years. Carolyn moved closer, her footsteps silent on the silk rug. She didn't look at him with the pity her son had used. She looked at him with the recognition of a fellow soldier. I know that thin air, she whispered. For the last decade, I felt like a clock that had been wound too tight and then forgotten on a shelf. My family, they didn't want me to live. They wanted me to endure. They wanted me to be a quiet monument to a life already lived. She set her glass down, her gaze unflinching. I thought my heart had stopped beating years ago, Maruhan. I thought the only thing left for me was the sunset. I was waiting for the dark. Maruhan stepped into her space. The age gap, that 20-year chasm that the world would whisper about, simply evaporated. In the dim light, they weren't a 50-year-old mogul and a 70-year-old widow. They were two jagged souls who had finally found a matching edge. And now? He asked, his breath warm against her temple. Now, Carolyn said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw, her touch bold and direct. I think I'm just waking up. Maruhan closed his eyes, leaning into her hand, the ruthlessness that defined him. The Mafia persona that terrified the continent slid away, leaving only a man who was profoundly, devastatingly lonely. He turned his head and kissed the palm of her hand, a gesture of such raw vulnerability that it felt more intimate than any physical act. Don't go back to the sunset, he murmured against her skin. Stay in the light with me. There was no rush, no frantic heat of youth. It was a slow, deliberate burn, the kind that lasts because it has been fueled by years of waiting. He took her face in both his hands, his thumb stroking her cheekbones with a reverence that made Carolyn's breath hitch. In the silence of the glass kingdom, the world below ceased to exist. There were no boards to appease, no families to fight, and no clocks ticking toward an end. There was only the hum of the city, the warmth of the silk, and two hearts beating in a rhythm that time had no power to break. The serenity of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by a notification. A headline on the wall-sized digital screen in Maruhan's study flickered to life, casting a cold blue light over the room. Kidnapped or coerced. American family pleads for return of socialite from tech tyrant's grip. Carolyn stood frozen as she stared at the pixelated image of her son, Robert, standing in front of the L-Gate headquarters in Seoul. He looked haggard, his tie loosened, a calculated costume of a grieving son. Beside him, Susan held a handkerchief to her eyes, playing the role of the distraught daughter-in-law for a swarm of international paparazzi. They're here, Carolyn whispered. The betrayal felt like a sudden drop in a high-speed elevator. Maruhan appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of granite. He didn't look at the screen. He looked only at her. They landed 4 hours ago. Private charter. Funded by a consortium of my competitors who would love to see a human rights scandal attached to my name. They don't want me, Maruhan, Carolyn said, her voice regaining its gravelly edge. They want a settlement. They want money. They want the old woman back in her box so they can feel powerful again. I can have them deported by sunrise, Maruhan said, his voice dropping to the dangerous subsonic level. I can make it so they never step foot on this continent again. But the media, they will call me a captor. They will say I am the Mafia they always whispered I was. The phone in Carolyn's hand vibrated. It was a message from Robert. Mom, we're at the Grand Hyatt. The press is with us. If you don't come down and sign the rescission of the L-Gate Trust, we tell the world he's a criminal who's brainwashed you. Don't let this monster ruin our family name. The lobby of the Grand Hyatt Seoul. The confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened in the gold-leafed, high-ceilinged opulence of the Hyatt lobby, under the flashbulbs of 50 cameras. Robert and Susan stood like a wall of false virtue as the elevator doors opened. They expected a frail woman, perhaps tearful and confused. Instead, the doors revealed Carolyn Henry, dressed in a sharp, structured white suit that made her look like a bolt of lightning. She walked alone, Maruhan watching from the mezzanine above, a shadow protector. "Mom!" Robert cried out, reaching for her arm with a practiced desperation. "Thank God! We're here to take you home. This man, he's dangerous. He's manipulated you." Carolyn stepped back, her movement so precise it made Robert stumble. The cameras clicked frantically. "The only manipulation in this room, Robert, is the grease on your forehead," Carolyn said, her voice clear and carrying. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked into her son's soul. "You didn't fly 15 hours because you missed me. You flew here because your bank accounts are empty and you realized you couldn't sell my house while I was still breathing in it." "Carolyn, please," Susan hissed, stepping closer. "Think of the scandal. People back home think you've lost your mind. A man his age. It's indecent. He's a predator." Carolyn turned to the wall of reporters. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She took the microphone from a stunned journalist's hand. "My name is Carolyn Henry," she said, her silver hair gleaming like a crown under the lobby lights. "For 70 years, I played the roles assigned to me. Daughter, wife, mother, widow. I was told that at 70 my life was a closed book. But the man you are trying to vilify, Maruhan Park Lee, is the only person who had the courage to read the pages I had left to write." She turned back to Robert, her eyes flashing with a terrifying ancient fire. "You are my blood, Robert, but you are not my family. Family is a sanctuary, not a cage. You came here for a payout? Here is your settlement." She reached into her clutch, pulled out the gold-leafed card Maruhan had given her, and tore it in half. She dropped the pieces at Robert's feet. "I am staying in Seoul, not as a captive and not as a senior. I am staying as a woman who has finally found a kingdom worth ruling." The silence that followed was absolute. Carolyn turned her back on the blood that had betrayed her and looked up at the mezzanine. Maruhan was standing there, his hand over his heart, a silent, rare gesture of total allegiance. She walked toward the exit, her head held high. Behind her, the family strike crumbled into a pathetic scramble for relevance. She had chosen the stranger who saw her over the family that looked past her. As she reached the car, Maruhan was already there, holding the door. "That was a dangerous move, Virginia," he whispered, his eyes burning with pride. "I told you, Soul," she replied, sliding into the leather seat. I'm done being sweet. If they want a scandal, let's give them a dynasty instead. The rain in Seoul had turned to a fine silver mist by the time they returned to the Elgate stronghold. Inside the war room, the atmosphere was combustible. Maruhan stood before a digital map of Virginia, his fingers hovering over a console. I've traced their flight cost to a shell company owned by Kang, Maruhan said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. I'm going to liquidate Robert's remaining holdings. By tomorrow morning, he won't be able to afford a bus ticket, let alone a lawsuit. I'll ensure Susan's charitable board positions are revoked. I will erase them, Carolyn. They tried to use you as a weapon against me. In my world, that is a death sentence. Carolyn walked to the center of the room, her silhouette sharp against the glowing screens. She placed her hand over his on the console, grounding his kinetic fury. But if you crush them, you make them martyrs. You prove every lie they told the press tonight. You become the tech mafia kidnapper they claimed you were, and I become the helpless victim who needs a man to fight her battles. Maruhan's eyes flashed. They deserve to be erased. They are my blood, Maruhan, Carolyn countered, her voice gaining a direct, unyielding edge. Betrayal doesn't dissolve a mother's memory of the boy he used to be. If you destroy him, you leave a hole in my history that no amount of your gold can fill. I don't want him destroyed. I want him corrected. Maruhan lowered his hand, his brow furrowing. Corrected? He is a shark, Carolyn. He's a goldfish who thinks he's a shark because he's only ever lived in a small bowl, she corrected. I won't have his ruin on my conscience. I've spent 70 years building a life of grace. I won't end it by being the reason my son sleeps on the street. That is a weight I refuse to carry. Maruhan turned to her, his dark eyes flashing. They betrayed you. They tried to sell your life. I know, Carolyn said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. And that is why I'm going to handle this. Your way involves blood and wreckage. My way involves a mirror. I'm going to show them exactly what they've become. She leaned in, her thumb tracing the line of Maruhan's tense jaw. Cruelty is easy, Soul. Anyone with $1 billion can be cruel. But mercy? Mercy is the ultimate leverage. It keeps your hands clean and your enemies in your debt forever. Let me handle my son. I'll show him that the feeble woman he tried to cage is the only thing standing between him and the monster he thinks you are. Maruhan looked at her, the lethal tension in his shoulders finally snapping. He realized then that she wasn't just his equal in wisdom. She was his moral compass. She was protecting him from his own worst instincts. You are a terrifying woman, Virginia, he whispered, a smile of pure, dark admiration touching his lips. I'm a mother, Maruhan, she replied, turning back to the screen. And a mother knows exactly where to strike so it doesn't leave a bruise, but it never stops stinging. The executive suite, Grand Hyatt Seoul. Robert and Susan were pacing the opulent suite, surrounded by half-empty room service carts and the frantic glow of their smartphones. They were waiting for a wire transfer from Kang that would never come. The door opened without a knock. Maruhan stepped in first, his presence filling the room like a cold front. But he didn't speak. He stepped aside, and Carolyn walked into the center of the room. She wasn't carrying a weapon or a legal brief. She was carrying a small, weathered leather box. Mom, Robert started, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and greed. If you're here to talk about the settlement... Be quiet, Robert, Carolyn said. The sheer authority in her tone pinned him to his chair. She opened the box and took out a stack of old yellowed Polaroids and a set of silver cufflinks. She laid them on the coffee table. These were your father's, she said, her voice devoid of sentimentality, replaced by a terrifying clarity. And these are photos of you at 5, at 10, at 20. I didn't raise a predator, Robert. I raised a son. And somewhere along the way, you decided that my life was an asset to be liquidated to cover your own mediocrity. We were just trying to protect you, Susan shrieked. Her face flushed. Carolyn turned her gaze to Susan, a look so direct and piercing that the younger woman actually recoiled. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting your social standing in a country club that doesn't even like you. You flew across the world to call a man a monster because he gave me the one thing you never could, respect. Carolyn leaned down, her face inches from Robert's. Maruhan wanted to cut your work off tonight. He has the power to make it so you never work again. He has the power to take your home, your cars, and your name. Robert's hands began to shake. But I stopped him, Carolyn continued, not because I love the man you've become, but because I respect the woman I am. I won't have your ruin on my conscience. Here is the leverage, Robert. Maruhan was the man who purchased your debts. Every single cent you owe is owed by him. You will return to Virginia. You will live in your house. You will keep your job. Robert looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But, Carolyn's voice turned to ice, you will pay back every penny to the Elgate Foundation. Every month for the rest of your life, you will write a check to a charity that supports elderly independence. You will be a living monument to your own failure. If you ever speak to the press again, if you ever mention my name or Maruhan's, the grace ends, the debt will be called in full, and you will be on the street within the hour. She stood up, smoothing her suit. She looked at them. Two people who had tried to bury her and felt nothing but a profound, liberating pity. You thought 70 was the end for me, Carolyn said, moving toward the door where Maruhan waited. But it was only the end for you. Don't call me again. I've found a life that doesn't have room for ghosts. They left the suite in a silence so heavy, it felt like a physical weight. Robert and Susan didn't move. They sat in the wreckage of their own greed, silenced not by force, but by the absolute leverage of mercy. In the hallway, Maruhan caught Carolyn's hand. He looked at her with a new kind of awe. You didn't break them, he whispered. You hollowed them out. That's the secret to true power, Soul, Carolyn said, her eyes bright with the thrill of the win. You don't need to spill blood when you can simply take away their breath. Maruhan pulled her close, his heart thundering against her shoulder. I have much to learn from you, Virginia. Then it's a good thing, she smiled, that we have plenty of time. The glass-walled boardroom of Elgate Tower felt like a pressurized chamber. Outside, the morning headlines were screaming about a security breach in the global satellite grid, a glitch that had frozen financial markets from London to Tokyo. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and the cold sweat of men preparing for a coup. Maruhan sat at the head of the obsidian table, his face a mask of terrifying stillness. To the board, he looked like a king whose crown was slipping. To Carolyn, who sat in a velvet chair by the window, he looked like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. The stock has dropped 12% in 4 hours, Chairman, said Director O, a man whose loyalty had always been tied to the highest bidder. The public is questioning your focus. They see you at galas with American guests. They see a man distracted. Perhaps it is time for a transition of leadership, for the good of the empire. Maruhan didn't blink. He leaned forward, the light from the digital wall reflecting in his dark eyes. You speak of transition. Oh, while your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands saw a mysterious influx of $5 million last night, did you think I wouldn't notice the scent of a bribe? The room went silent. Maruhan began to pull a series of black tablets from his briefcase, sliding them across the table like shurikens. Director Park, your gambling debts in Macau have been settled by me. You now owe your soul to Elgate. Director Kim, the evidence of your son's hit and run has been moved to my private server. You will vote as I tell you, or the police will be at your door by lunch. One by one, he was buying them back, using the Mafia leverage that had built his throne. It was a masterclass in ruthless efficiency, but Carolyn watched the screens. Her eyes, sharpened by decades of spotting fakes in the art world, weren't looking at the men. She was looking at the code flickering on the master monitor. The glitch that had paralyzed the world. Maruhan, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. The board members looked at her with disdain, but Maruhan turned instantly. Yes, Carolyn. Stop buying them, she said, standing up and walking toward the massive data display. You're fighting a fire in the room while the house is being flooded from the basement. She pointed to a repeating string of characters in the satellite telemetry. I don't know code, but I know patterns. This isn't a glitch, and it isn't a hack from the outside. Look at the timestamp. Every time the signal drops, it's preceded by a microsecond burst of data from a localized source. Maruhan stood, his eyes narrowing as he followed her finger. His lead engineer started to protest, but Maruhan silenced him with a glance. Go on. It's an internal heartbeat, Carolyn said. In the gallery world, we call it a marker. It's a way to prove provenance. Someone didn't just break the system, they tagged it so they could reclaim it later. It's not an attack, Maruhan. It's a hostile takeover from the inside. Maruhan's hands flew over the holographic interface. He bypassed 3 layers of security, digging deeper into the core architecture than even his engineers dared. Suddenly, a name flashed in the hidden metadata of the crash. It wasn't a competitor. It was the name of the snake Maruhan thought he had cut loose weeks ago. Choi. The former COO hadn't just left. He had left a logic bomb that only he could defuse. And the board members in this room were waiting for the bomb to go off so they could rescue the company with Choi at the helm. You were right, Maruhan whispered, his voice thick with a new kind of respect. He looked at the board members, who were now ashen-faced. You didn't see it because you were too busy looking for a way to betray me, but she saw it because she was looking at the truth. Maruhan didn't just fire them. He used the glitch to lock their personal assets into the Elgate mainframe. Since you like transitions so much, he said, you will transition your shares to the Elgate Foundation immediately, or I let the glitch erase your identities entirely. As the disgraced directors filed out, Maruhan leaned against the table, his chest heaving. The empire was safe, but the weight of it seemed to press harder than ever. Carolyn walked over and straightened his lapel. You have the power, Maruhan, but you need to stop looking for enemies in the dark and start looking for the patterns in the light. Maruhan pulled her into his arms, hiding his face in the crook of her neck. They almost had me, he admitted. They never had a chance, Carolyn whispered. They were playing a game of checkers. We're building a legacy. The seasonal rains had returned to Seoul, washing the neon glow into long, bleeding streaks of violet and gold. In the silence of the penthouse, the packing of a single leather suitcase sounded like a series of small, rhythmic heartbreaks. Carolyn stood by the window, her reflection ghost-like against the storm. Her 90-day visa sat on the obsidian desk, the red expired date looming like a countdown. She had changed. The woman who had arrived in a vintage Chanel suit was gone. In her place was a woman who had outmaneuvered CEOs and looked into the eyes of a titan. But as she folded a silk scarf, a cold, familiar doubt clawed at her chest. Was she just his greatest acquisition? A rare antique he had rescued from a dusty Virginia shelf to prove he could? "The flight is logged for 6 o'clock, a voice gravitated from the doorway. Maruhan stood there, stripped of his blazer, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked weary, the sharp lines of his face softened by a grief he didn't know how to name. "I know," Carolyn said, not turning around. "Robert has been calling. He's remodeled the guest room. He thinks I'm coming home to play the role of the forgiven mother." Maruhan stepped into the room, the air tightening between them. "Is that what you want? To go back to the sunset?" "I want to know what I am to you, Maruhan," she said, finally turning. Her directness, the very thing that had first hooked him, was now a blade between them. "I've spent 70 years being someone's something. A wife, a mother, a legacy. Here, I've been your secret weapon, your confidant. But the visa ends, and the project is over. Am I just a win you've checked off your list?" Maruhan flinched as if she'd struck him. He was a man who bought companies to silence them, who moved satellites to watch his enemies. He knew how to command, how to demand, and how to conquer. But he did not know how to ask. He walked to the desk, picking up the visa. He looked at it for a long time before laying it back down. "I have spent my life owning things, Carolyn," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I own the towers, the data, the people who work in them. I thought that was power, but then you walked off that plane, and I realized I didn't want to own you. I wanted to deserve you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum rim folder. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the suitcase, stopping her from closing it. "This is an appointment to the board of directors of Elgate," he said. "A 5-year contract as the head of global strategy. It carries a diplomatic residency. You would never have to worry about a visa again. You would be the most powerful woman in this city." Carolyn looked at the papers, then back at him. "A job, Maruhan? You're offering me a chair at a table?" "No." Maruhan stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to cup her face. The Mafia of tech was gone, replaced by a man who was terrified of the silence that would follow her departure. "I am offering you the chair because you are the only one who sees the world clearly. But I am asking you to stay because without you, the world is just noise." He dropped to one knee, not as a submissive, but as a man finally surrendering to a force greater than himself. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the knuckles that had once held a glass of a lonely Scotch in Virginia. "I can't own you, Carolyn Henry. You are a wildfire, but I am asking, not as your chairman, not as your soul, but as a man who was dead until a wrong number woke him up. Don't go back. Stay. Rule this kingdom with me, not as my project, as my heart. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was expectant. Carolyn looked down at the man who had changed her life, and then at the suitcase. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached down and began to unpack. "You're a very difficult man to say no to, Maruhan Park Lee," she whispered, her eyes shining with a vibrant, defiant light. "Does that mean you're staying?" Carolyn smiled, a bold, direct expression that outshone the city lights. "It means I need a bigger closet. We have a dynasty to build." The skyline of Seoul was a jagged crown of glass and light, but tonight, the brightest point was the newly inaugurated Henry Lee Global Center. 1 year had passed since a wrong number had skipped across the Pacific, and the world was still reeling from the shockwaves. Inside the center's gala hall, the creme de la creme of Asia and the West stood in hushed circles. They weren't whispering about starlets or scandals anymore. They were waiting for the chairwoman. The double doors opened, and the room fell into a rhythmic, respectful silence. Carolyn Henry did not walk. She commanded the space she moved through. At 71, she looked younger than she had at 60. She wore an ivory velvet gown, and her silver hair was styled and let loose. On her finger sat a band of black jade, not an engagement ring, but a seal of partnership. Behind her, 2 paces back, a position of both protection and pride, walked Maruhan Park Lee. He looked rejuvenated, the predatory edge of his face softened by a visible, grounding peace. They reached the podium. The cameras, once used to hunt them, now waited for their every word. "A year ago," Carolyn began, her voice a rich velvet resonance that filled the hall without the need for a microphone, "I was told that my life was a closed book. I was told that 70 was a destination, a place where one sits quietly and waits for the light to fade." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room, landing on a group of young tech entrepreneurs who looked at her with genuine awe. "But I found a collaborator," she continued, glancing back at Maruhan. His eyes didn't leave her face. They were the eyes of a man who had found his soul's equal. And together, we realized that power isn't about how much you own. It's about how much life you refuse to give up. The Henry Lee Foundation is not a charity for the elderly. It is an incubator for the experienced, because the world is too fragile to be left only to those who haven't yet learned how to survive it. The applause was deafening, a roar of recognition. Later that night, the noise of the world was a soft hum 100 floors below. Carolyn stood on the balcony, a glass of that same 20-year-old scotch in her hand. But this time, the ice didn't clink against a lonely glass. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Maruhan rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "Robert called the office today," Maruhan murmured. "He wanted to know if you'd seen the news. Apparently, his local paper in Virginia ran a 3-page spread on the Queen of Seoul." Carolyn chuckled, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "And what did he say?" "He said he was proud of you, and then he asked if the foundation was hiring consultants." Carolyn turned in his arms, her eyes dancing with mischief. "Tell him we only hire people who can look a shark in the eye without blinking. He's not quite there yet." Maruhan smiled, the rare, genuine smile that only Carolyn ever saw. He reached out, his thumb tracing the vibrant line of her jaw. You've changed everything, Carolyn. The board meetings are shorter. My enemies are quieter. And I can breathe. He looked out at the city they had conquered together. Are you a ghost yet, Carolyn Henry? Carolyn leaned into him, the silver of her hair catching the neon violet of the Seoul night. She looked at the man who had seen her when the rest of the world had looked away, and she felt the pulse of a life that was only just beginning. No, she whispered, her voice bold and direct as it had always been. I'm just getting started. The ghost of Seoul and the lady in bloom stood together against the dark, two halves of a new dynasty, proving to the world that the most addictive stories don't end at sunset. They wait for the dawn. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.